There is a particular kind of afternoon that arrives without warning. The house is quiet, the light has gone that certain shade of gold, and you are sitting there with a cup of something that has gone cold. Maybe the television is off. Maybe the phone has been silent for a few hours. The clock on the wall is the loudest thing in the room, and you are aware of it in a way you never were when the house was full. You are not doing anything. And somehow that feels strange, like you should be, like stillness is a problem to be solved. There is something sitting in your chest that you cannot quite name. It is not sadness exactly. It is heavier than that, and quieter. It arrives with the afternoon light and it stays until the evening does something to the room. You have felt this before. You may have told yourself it is nothing. You may have reached for the remote, or made a phone call, or found something to tidy, anything to move away from the feeling and from the quiet that carries it. But what if that afternoon, that specific, heavy, golden quiet, is not something to escape from? What if something extraordinary is happening inside your brain while you sit there? The wrong assumption. Most people believe that loneliness in older age means something has gone wrong, that the quiet afternoons are a symptom, a sign of decline, a gap where life used to be. And that belief is understandable. It is also wrong. The reality is far more extraordinary than that. When you sit alone in a quiet room after 60, your brain does not go still. It does not slow down or drift into some low-power state while it waits for company. What is actually happening in those hours is one of the most complex, layered, and important processes the human brain is capable of, and almost no one has ever told you that. Welcome back to the Aging Mind. Subscribe before you leave, because what you are about to learn about what your brain is doing in those quiet hours will permanently change how you understand yourself, and what you do with that time. Today we are going through 8 things your brain is doing during lonely afternoons after 60, 8 processes that most people mistake for emptiness, or drift, or loss. Stay until the end, because the final section, about what these hours are actually building inside you over years, is the one that changes everything. And it is the one that most people over 60 have never been told. Not by their doctors. Not by anyone. Number 1. The network that wakes up when you are alone. You are sitting in that quiet room and your mind begins to move on its own. Not toward anything in particular. Just moving. A thought about something that happened last week. A face you haven't thought about in years. A sentence from a conversation you cannot place. Most people assume the brain is resting when this happens, idling, like a car at a red light, waiting for something real to do. That is not what is happening. Neuroscientists at Washington University in St. Louis spent years mapping brain activity across thousands of participants, and what they found stunned the field. A researcher named Marcus Rakel discovered that when the brain appears to be doing nothing, no task, no conversation, no external demand, a vast and intricate web of neural regions lights up in a coordinated pattern unlike anything seen during focused activity. They called it the default mode network. And it is not a resting state. It is one of the most metabolically expensive operations the brain performs. What this means for you is that the moments you have written off as empty, the drifting, the wandering mind, the afternoon that seemed to go nowhere, are the moments your brain chooses to run its deepest processes. It is not absence. It is activation. But what the default mode network is actually doing in those hours is something even more specific. And it is the next thing on this list. Number 2, the rehearsal room. You are alone, and you find yourself replaying a conversation. Maybe it was something said at dinner last week, a comment that landed wrong, a moment of tension that was never fully resolved. Maybe it is something older than that. A misunderstanding with someone you love. A goodbye you did not know was a goodbye at the time. Most people assume this is rumination, the mind stuck, circling something it cannot let go of, evidence of worry or regret. That is not what is happening. Researchers studying adult development at Harvard found that the social brain, the regions responsible for reading other people, for understanding motive and emotion and consequence, requires regular rehearsal to stay sharp. And the primary way it rehearses is exactly this: replaying social scenarios in solitude, refining its understanding of what happened and why, preparing itself for what comes next. The brain is not torturing you with the past. It is practicing. It is keeping one of your most sophisticated cognitive systems, your ability to understand other human beings, in working order. What this means for you is that every afternoon you spend turning something over in your mind is an afternoon your social brain is training. The people who think they are overthinking are often the ones whose emotional intelligence is sharpest. But there is something else happening in that silence, something structural, something that changes the brain at a cellular level. Number 3, what silence does to the hippocampus. The room is quiet. Not the quiet of a library, where silence is enforced. The particular quiet of your own home in the middle of an afternoon, ambient, soft, specific to that place and that hour. Most people assume silence is neutral, the absence of noise, nothing more, nothing less. A blank space between events. That is not what is happening. A researcher named Imke Kirst at Duke University was studying the effects of sound on the brain, specifically on mice, measuring how different kinds of auditory input affected neural development. She had included silence as a control condition, expecting it to produce nothing of note. What she found instead was something no one had predicted. 2 hours of silence per day caused measurable growth of new cells in the hippocampus, the region of the brain most directly associated with memory and learning. Silence did not just fail to harm the brain. It actively grew it. What this means for you is that the quiet afternoons you have been apologizing for, the ones you have called wasted, or lonely, or too empty, may be the very conditions your brain needs to maintain the structure of memory. The silence is not taking something away. It is building something. And while that building is happening, something else is moving through you. Something you may have mistaken for weakness. Number 4, the emotional library. You are alone, and a song comes on, something old, something you have heard 100 times. And it stops you. Not gently. It stops you completely, with a weight you were not prepared for. Or you pick up a photograph, and it holds you there longer than it should. Most people assume that this kind of emotional sensitivity in later life is fragility, a sign that the defenses are thinning, that you are becoming more vulnerable, less resilient than you once were. That is not what is happening. Researchers at the UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center studying emotional complexity across the lifespan found something that reframes this entirely. Emotional experience does not simplify with age, it deepens. The ability to hold multiple emotions at once, to feel grief and gratitude simultaneously, to experience something as both beautiful and painful in the same moment, this capacity measurably increases across the decades after 60. They called it emotional complexity, and it is a sign of neural sophistication, not decline. What this means for you is that when something moves you more deeply than it once did, your brain is not breaking down. It is more capable than it has ever been of processing the full register of human experience. That sensitivity is not a symptom. It is a skill. But alongside that depth, something else is present in those afternoons. Something that aches. Number 5, the loneliness signal and what it is actually asking for. There is a specific feeling that arrives in those quiet hours. Not a thought. A physical thing, a pull somewhere in the chest, a weight that has no clear location. You may have learned to move past it quickly. You may have decided it is self-pity, or that it means something unflattering about your life. Most people assume that this feeling is a sign of failure, of not having built enough connection, or of having let something important slip away. That is not what is happening. A neuroscientist at the University of Chicago named John Cacioppo spent decades studying loneliness, not as an emotional condition, but as a biological one. What he found was that the loneliness signal in the brain is neurologically identical to hunger. It activates the same alert systems, triggers the same urgency, and serves the same evolutionary purpose, not to punish you, but to direct you. Hunger tells the body it needs food. The loneliness signal tells the brain it needs connection. It is a navigational tool, not a verdict. What this means for you is that the ache is not evidence of what is missing from your life. It is evidence that your brain still knows what it values, and that it is still advocating for you. And while it advocates, something deeper is happening, something about what matters, and what does not. Number 6, the time perspective shift. In those quiet afternoons, something strange happens to your sense of what is important. The things that used to feel urgent, a disagreement, an inconvenience, a slight, seem smaller than they did. And other things, a particular kind of light, a voice on the phone, a small kindness, seem larger. More worth staying with. Most people assume this shift is resignation, that they are simply caring less, becoming passive, retreating from life. That is not what is happening. A psychologist at Stanford named Laura Carstensen developed what she called socio-emotional selectivity theory, the finding that as the brain moves through later life, it undergoes a measurable shift in how it allocates attention. It moves away from novelty and toward meaning. Away from quantity and toward depth. This is not decline. In brain imaging studies, the older brain showed significantly less activation in regions associated with negative emotional experience, not because feeling had diminished, but because the brain had become more efficient at directing its resources toward what it had determined to actually matter. What this means for you is that the clarity you feel in those quiet hours, about who deserves your time, what is worth your energy, what you would choose again and what you would not, is your brain operating with a kind of precision it took decades to develop. And with that precision comes something else. Something generative. Number 7, the creativity unlocked by loneliness. You are sitting in the quiet, not trying to think about anything in particular, and a solution arrives. Not to anything you were consciously working on. Just, there. An answer to something you had set down weeks ago. Or an idea that seems to come from nowhere, connecting two things you had never thought to connect before. Most people assume this is coincidence, a random spark, a lucky moment, nothing they could depend on or explain. That is not what is happening. Researchers studying creative cognition at the University of York found that the mind-wandering state, the unfocused, unstructured drifting that happens most naturally in solitude, is the condition most strongly associated with what they called associative thinking, the ability to draw unexpected connections between unrelated concepts. This is the cognitive foundation of creativity. And it does not happen in busy, structured time. It happens precisely in the hours that look, from the outside, like nothing at all. What this means for you is that the afternoon you spent sitting quietly, letting your mind move where it wanted, may have been the most productive creative session of your week, you just did not recognize it as that while it was happening. And all of this, every process we have covered, every hour of silence and drifting and emotional depth, is building something. Something measurable. Something the researchers did not expect to find. Number 8, what they are building without knowing it. You have spent years in these afternoons. Years of sitting with the quiet, the wandering mind, the ache, the clarity, the gold light through the window. You may have judged that time. You may have called it wasted, or lonely, or less than what came before. Most people assume that solitude in later life is simply what is left when other things have gone, a remainder, not a resource. That is not what is happening. A psychiatrist at UC San Diego named Dilip Jess spent years studying wisdom, not as a philosophical concept, but as a neurological one. He and his team identified specific brain structures associated with what we recognize as wisdom, the capacity to hold uncertainty without panic, to feel compassion without being overwhelmed, to see patterns across long spans of time, to make judgments that account for complexity rather than reducing it to noise. And when they looked at what conditions allowed those structures to develop and integrate most fully, one of the strongest predictors was regular periods of solitary contemplation over time. The quiet afternoons were not interruptions in the development of wisdom. They were part of the mechanism. What this means for you is that the hours you have spent in this particular kind of alone may have been building something in you that cannot be built any other way. There is something that needs to be said directly, not as a finding, not as a number on a list, but as something true. You have probably spent some portion of your life apologizing for needing quiet, explaining it away, calling it tiredness, or introversion, or a preference, as if it required a label that made it acceptable. You may have sat in that afternoon light and felt, somewhere beneath the quiet, the low hum of a question you did not want to ask out loud: is this it? Is this what my days are now? That question deserves an honest answer. The afternoons changed. That is true. The noise that used to fill a house, children, schedules, the particular weight of a life organized around other people's needs, that noise is gone for many of you, and its absence has a shape. A specific gravity. You have felt it. You know exactly what that shape is. Grief does not always announce itself with tears. Sometimes it arrives as a Tuesday afternoon in October, with the clock ticking and the cup gone cold, and the specific, untranslatable feeling that the world is moving without you. That you have become somehow less visible. That the parts of you that once mattered most, your energy, your usefulness, your centrality to something, have quietly moved to the edges of things. That feeling is real. It is not self-pity. It is not weakness. It is one of the most honest emotional responses a human being can have to the particular shape that later life takes, and almost no one talks about it clearly. But here is what else is true. The person sitting in that quiet room is not diminished. The person who has lived long enough to know what silence feels like, who has felt enough, lost enough, loved enough to carry that particular weight in their chest on a golden afternoon, that person is not less than they were. They are more complex than they have ever been. More capable of depth. More practiced in the very things that matter most, and least practiced in pretending otherwise. The brain you are living in right now, the one that wanders and aches and grows new cells in the quiet and rehearses love in the dark and builds wisdom in the hours that looked like nothing, that brain is not declining. It is doing something far harder than that. It is learning to be present in a life that has gotten quieter, and finding, slowly, that there is more in the quiet than anyone told you to expect. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are exactly where one of the most remarkable processes in human biology needs you to be. Sitting still. Letting the afternoon come. Community close. Tell me in the comments, is there a specific time of day when the quiet finds you, and what does your mind do when it arrives? You do not have to dress it up or explain it. Just say what is true. I read every one. I will see you in the next one.